Time. Okay, it is October 18th, 1984. The time is 7:30 p.m. and the place is Mr. William Fuller McGowan's residence.
McCowan, McCowan.
McCowan.
I got a picture of you in your airplane form.
Do you?
Yes, when you were to your two.
Well, you have that.
Now?
Yeah, see
Nice.
if you can find it. See if you can find that here.
Fuller, what war did you fight in?
World War II.
And how did you get into the war? Were you enlisted or were you drafted?
Well, I enlisted about a month before I would have been drafted in January 8th, 1942.
What branch of the armed services did you serve in?
Army Air Corps.
How old were you when you entered the war?
22.
What was your occupation at the time?
Structural iron worker in Buffalo, New York.
Were you married?
No.
Where did you live? Oh, we already covered that. Did a lot of people that you knew go into the armed services with you?
Two of my buddies and I from Uniontown, Pennsylvania, which is my hometown, joined together.
Did any of the members of your family serve before you?
Well, you mean in World War I?
In World War II.
No, no one in World War II.
What was your rank when you were discharged?
First lieutenant.
Did you receive any decorations?
Yes, the Distinguished Flying Cross, the Air Medal, the Purple Heart, and the European Theater of Operations battle thing with 4 stars on it.
What major battles did you participate in?
Well, they ranked them as, let's see, you want to keep it running while I think here?
All right. Get them on together.
Okay, arrived in England in October 43. We went into combat in January 44, participated in the air battles prior to D-Day, then the D-Day invasion, and then the I guess you could call the battle for Europe. And there was a 4th one, which I can't recall.
What units did you serve with?
The 363rd Fighter Group and the 358th Fighter Group.
Can you remember any of your commanding officers?
Yes, James Tipton was the last commanding officer of the 358th. Wells was the prior commander of the 358th. 363rd, was that? Can't recall. Oh, I can't recall 363rd guy.
What job were you trained to do?
Fighter escort.
Where did you receive your combat training?
Well, I took all my, prior to getting my wings, I took my training in Texas, and then flew, then in the eastern part of the United States, flew on maneuvers there in P-40s and then later P-51s.
Did you believe in the cause you were going to fight for?
Absolutely.
What did they tell you about your enemy in your training camps?
That he was out to conquer the world. They were out to conquer the world, and that we had to stop them.
Do you ever remember anyone in civilian life who was against getting involved in the war?
No.
Do you remember any demonstrations against the war?
No, I don't.
Do you remember anyone demonstrating for the war?
Well, of course, you had your bond rallies and things of that nature, but no, you didn't need parades at that time. Everyone was charged up and ready.
What were your personal feelings about the enemy before you entered combat?
Well, I felt he had to be stopped. I felt he was ruthless, and that we had to go in and get him.
Very good. Let me stop. How did you feel after your first actual combat experience? Or excuse me, where did you have your first actual combat experience?
First experience, and this is a strange happening. We went over the coast of, I believe it was Belgium at that time, and all of a sudden a big black burst of flak comes up, and I could see it bursting to my rear and underneath, and this great orange center comes out, and the left wing of my Mustang lifted up a little bit, and I looked down, and all of a sudden it's almost like a change in your life. Up to that point, you're happy-go-lucky, and you're a fighter pilot, and you're the greatest thing on earth, and you look down and see this, and you suddenly think to yourself, you know, someone's mad at me. I can't believe this. And I think that is when you finally realize you're in a war. Up to that time, it was, you know, just fun and games. But then, from that point on, it got a little serious.
Yeah. What did they, meaning your commanding officers, tell you before you went into the combat zone?
You mean pre-flight?
Yes.
Of course, you were briefed on, and you wrote down on the back of your hands in ink that could be rubbed off if you run down, if you were shot down, your coordinates. That is, you know, you pick up the bomber formations in relays. You don't escort bombers all the way across, which a lot of people think you do. We would pick them up because we were in the Mustangs, a long range. We would pick them up, say they're going to Hamburg, which I believe was my first mission. We would pick them up just like inside Germany, or before they hit what they call the IP, the initial point before bombing, take them in over the target and bring them back. You have coordinates at the altitude, the time, and the point where you're going to rendezvous with them. And and then the intelligence officer would brief you as to where you could expect the heaviest flak from, where the German fighter units were based, the airfields where they were based, and where you could expect the opposition to be the strongest.
Very good. Before you went into combat, can you tell me some of the feelings you experienced?
Well, of course, in the beginning, when you're on your first missions, you're excited, you're eager, you're ready, and then after you have a few, for instance, I flew 60 missions. You know, after a while, you begin to think a little more about it than you did in the beginning. In other words, the sport, it's worn off a little bit, and you think it becomes more of a job then when you're going in, and after you get a little battle weary.
At the combat front, what was it like living on the air base in which you live?
In England, it was beautiful. We had you know, comfortable quarters, and the food was reasonably good, and it was warm, and it was good. It was fine. But then, after we got to France, the living conditions went down, and in some bases we were living on K rations and things like that. Let me tell you two interesting experiences. Our first base in France was a former German fighter base just outside of Cherbourg. And we got in those barracks there, and we all got lice that the Germans had left on there. This was in July of 44, and here we are up trying to fly and scratch at the same time, which is not too swift. And so that was one thing, and we didn't have much of the basics then because the supply lines were just clogged up. You just couldn't get the stuff. So one day we were on a fighter sweep up through France and Belgium, and came back, and all the bases there in forward bases in France that time were fogged in. We couldn't get in. So we flew across and landed at Plymouth at a British naval base there. And we got in, we took a shower. We hadn't had a shower in 2 weeks. This was about the middle of July. There's no shower facilities there, no bathing facilities. You washed out of a helmet, you shaved out of a helmet, you did everything with it. And so we got in there and we all got showers, and the Wrens there shined their shoes for us. And we asked them if they had any bread. So we opened up our wings things where the guns are, and we all came back with about 10 loaves of bread in our wings. And when we got back, we were really heroes at our base because of this. I think if the Germans had ever jumped us that time, I'm not sure we'd been able to fire or not. That was strange. But the living conditions at the bases in France were less
Primitive.
Pretty primitive. Now, of course, you live in some place like one time one of our bases was with Montmelon, the old the French equivalent of West Point, and we occupied that.
Is that where you had servants?
Well, we had maids to clean the rooms up for us, yes, things like that. And it got a little better. But when we were stationed at Vitry-le-Francois, we had to be towed out to this wire mesh that we took off from. Because the mud was so deep, we couldn't taxi out and just take off one at a time going down that thing, and it was pretty hairy.
Very good. A few seconds ago, you commented on your first combat experience. What, besides your immediate reaction, what was the post-reaction that you experienced after that first baptism of fire?
Exhilaration, really. The exhilaration was, especially when you got into a dogfight, the exhilaration was there. Here you are. There's a dogfight usually doesn't last more than a minute and a half, or something like that, because you're scattered all over the place, and that sky is awfully large. So you get lost, and it's even tough to form up again, and you can't do that sort of work in the bombers. But once you go in the dogfight, there's enough planes there. Very, very difficult to even reform up. So consequently, these things didn't last. Some of them lasted longer, but ordinarily a dogfight lasts a minute and a half, up to 3.5 minutes.
You mentioned just briefly that you were in the combat zone for 60 missions. How long was that in terms of time? Was this 6 months, 12 months, a year?
I was in combat from January 44 till the 1st of November 44. Then I got shut up and was sent back to the States.
Do you remember any of your personal attitudes about the war changing as a result of your experience?
Of the war changing?
Yes. Did the war change your attitudes at all that you had held previously?
Oh, no. I still thought we were in the right, and certainly was all out to win the war. But as I mentioned before, after you've flown 40, 50 missions, the exhilarating aspect of it perhaps wears off, and it becomes more of a business-like proposition, because a lot of your buddies have been shot down or
Severely wounded.
sent back to the States. You've got new replacements coming in, and even though they may be as old as you were, and toward the end there, they were even bringing guys over from training command, and some of them were older than we were, and even outranked us, yet we're leading them into combat.
You were leading, in other words, someone who outranked you in the combat?
I had a major flying my wing.
And you were a first lieutenant?
First lieutenant, yes.
Did you ever see any Germans up close that you had combat with at any time?
No, I never did. Not knowingly anyhow. No.
Very good. The people at home, how did you feel about them and your government?
No, I thought we had their utmost support.
Very good. Very good. And the government, do you feel that the government did everything possible to prosecute the war to its fullest possible potential?
As far as I could see, they did, yes.
Very good. I'm going to stop in a minute. When you were with the Ninth Air Force, what type of aircraft did you fly?
Well, in the beginning, before our 51s came over, we flew the Spitfires just to keep our hand in at flying.
You flew combat missions in the
no,
Spitfires?
No, I didn't fly any combat missions in Spitfires. We just would fly around England in them there for several months until our 51s came in and we became ready, brought our unit up to readiness. And the Spitfire was a beautiful plane to fly. Just aerobatically, it was just great. It wasn't as fast as the others, but I remember they had a wing of P-38 Lightnings there that had just come over and were in training, and we used to go over and dogfight with them until so many of them spun in that they requested we no longer go over there and do that, which was, an interesting point. The Lightning was too big, too large an aircraft, in my opinion, to engage with the German planes. Remember one thing, that the German aircraft was much smaller than ours, even smaller. Well, it was about the size of the Spitfire, maybe a little smaller, much smaller. Our 51s were even larger than theirs, and goodness knows our P-47s were much larger, much heavier than theirs. The 51, as far as I'm concerned, was the greatest air-to-air combat plane in the war. It was great. It's maneuverable and great when you got above 15,000 feet. It was wonderful. But as far after we got over to France and were doing close support work, the P-51 with that inline engine just would not take it. You had too many exposed oil lines in there, and the P-47 with that radial engine was the greatest dive bomber, in my opinion, in the European theater. Now, I can't answer for the Asian theater because it wasn't there, but it was great. That inline engine, we'd have people come back saying a rough engine, and the crew chief say, yes, it should be. One of your cylinders is knocked out. And it would take a huge beating and come back.
You flew both?
Flew both, yes. 2 months after we were into France, they broke the 363rd up and sent the pilots to various other units among the 9th Air Force, and we were transferred to P-47s, which we hated at the time because we loved the 51, but it proved out that they were right. It was a great plane for use as a dive bomber, strafing, and things like that. Also, of course, the 51 had the 650 millimeter cannons, 650 millimeters machine guns in it. The P-47 had 8 50 millimeters in it, and you could do much more damage. As a matter of fact, some of our guys in combat with those things would be in a tight climbing turn firing and would stall out. That's how much power that those 850 calibers had.
Absolutely. Now, when you were in combat, can you remember some of the German or Axis aircraft that you encountered and what you thought of them at the time?
Well, of course, the two, I never saw the Heinkels. I never saw any Heinkels. The only German aircraft I ever saw were the Me-109s, the Messerschmitts, and the FW-190s, the Focke-Wulfs. The Focke-Wulf, the Me-109, of course, looked somewhat like the P-51, and the Focke-Wulf with the radial engine looked something like the 47, although it wasn't nearly as large, didn't have that big an engine in it. But they were both good aircraft. I guess for air-to-air combat, the Me-109 was probably the best of the lot. Of course, it depended upon the guys who were flying them. I know in the early part of the war, they had the Hermann Göring Squadron, called them the Abbeville Boys. They were based at Abbeville there in Belgium, and they had the cowling with the black and yellow design on them. And we knew if we ever ran into the Abbeville Boys, we were in for a very, very rough afternoon. They were good. The thing about the German fighter pilot, I think the early part of the war, when we first got into it in January, and I'm sure this is true prior to that, that they were very, very good pilots. Then toward the last there in September and October, even in August, even in July and August, the caliber of the pilots went downhill. For instance, I know that in a dogfight you get on those guys, and some of them would just panic and fly straight and level instead of doing anything else. Caliber of their pilots went downhill very rapidly. Of course, you can imagine, number one, they didn't have the gasoline to train them on, which is one of the big factors in the war, believe me. Big factors, the lack of gasoline for the German planes. They have plenty of planes, but the pilot, the attrition in January and February, and in my opinion, we whipped the Luftwaffe in those 2 months. After that, they were not as aggressive. You didn't see them as often. And I think in February, you can say that the German Air Force was, if not put out of commission, was dealt a very, very severe blow. We, on some of the captured airfields, there'd be some planes there, and during the latter part of the war, or my latter part of the war there, in September, October of 44, we get up there and the stench of the planes was terrific. It was terrible because they were using vegetable oil instead of mineral oil for their engines, which was amazing. Which shows you, they're running out of petroleum.
You took part in two distinct phases to the war, the strategic air war and the tactical air war.
Mm-hmm.
Could you give us a little bit of your knowledge about the aircraft involved, the B-17 and the B-24? What could you tell us about each one, or what do you know about each one that you consider would be interesting or important?
Well, we always knew which what planes and that we were out to protect on a given mission. And we knew that if we were protecting the 24s, we were going to be in for a rough afternoon, because the Germans always seem to pick on the 24s before they pick on the 17s. And watching some of the 24s and they get hit with flak, they just seem to go poof, just up in sort of a ball of flame, where a 17 would take a hit and keep going, or even if they turn back, seem to make it back. I thought that at least the Germans seemed to feel that they had more chance against the 24. Now, I don't know whether that was the reason or whether they felt they had better armament on them. Whatever it was, they seemed to attack them more readily than the 17.
Very good. Now, the strategic air war, the bombing of the cities, the bombing of the military targets, when you were there, what was your impression of that? Was it an effective way to win the war?
Oh, I think it was a very effective way to win the war. I think they took out factories and things like this, although it didn't seem to cripple production. But the fact that the effect of on the populace, the morale of the populace, I think was tremendous. For instance, I have a friend who was married to a German woman who was there as a teenager during the war. They lived in Berlin, and she said it was just horrible. She said they seemed to always be in the bomb shelters, the Americans by day, the British by night, bombing, bombing, bombing. She said their nerves just became absolutely shattered. So I think the effect, if nothing else, on morale, of course you can put factories underground or you can camouflage them, and maybe you don't get them all, but I do think that you can hide a marshalling yards, and I do think that the German means of transportation via railroads was severely hampered.
So from your personal experience, you do agree that the air power in the European theater was a significant reason for the defeat of the Axis?
Oh, I definitely think so. First of all, if we hadn't achieved command of the air, D-Day would have been impossible. Would have never gotten those beaches. Never. And I think that was one thing. We absolutely had to, and we had not only superiority, I don't think that more than 10 airplanes showed up that entire day of D-Day. None of us saw any.
What I'd like to get from you, if I may, was a few stories, if we could, about the tactical aspect or the close air support that you flew. First of all, you've heard of the many stories, I'm sure, about close air support that was much more dangerous than it was helpful for our troops. On the missions you flew, what can you share with us about that type of the air war?
Well, I was in the 19th Tactical Air Command of the 9th Air Force under General Whalen. We supported Patton all the way across Europe. As a matter of fact, for the first time in history, Patton did not put out a side guard to guard his flanks to the south. We covered his south flank for him. That's the first time in history that that's ever been done, and he could do that because we could spot things and take care of them, so he didn't have to do that. But the problem with Patton was no one ever knew where he was. In our briefings in the morning before we would take off on a mission, they would tell us where they want us to bomb, where they want us to dive bomb and strafe, but they said, now, you've got to be careful. We know who's here, but we're not sure where Patton's troops are right now. They could be way ahead, some units be way ahead. Of course, the Cerise panels that they put out on their tanks helped us identify, because it's very difficult when you're flying up there at 10,000 feet to identify a tank, even though the Tiger was big and all, and if you get down close enough, you could tell, but it's very difficult to identify anything from that far up in the air. Now, in the beginning, after D-Day, when we were supporting the units across there, we were fighting them, we were trying to get them in the hedgerows, and everything was hidden. It was very difficult to know exactly where our front lines were, even though we had the map there and would try to get as close as we could. But one big factor, I think, in close support came later on, and that was when we put fighter pilots up there as forward observers, because they knew our problems. They could identify where we were to drop and where we were to hit much, much better than some infantryman up there who doesn't know the problems of the guy up in the air. And that helped a great deal to stop this bombing our own troops. I'm sure we bombed and strafed our own troops at times, but it's just one of those things that, it just couldn't be helped when you're zooming down there at
what would
250, 300 miles an hour. It's difficult to pick out the exact target. And of course, you've got flak coming up from here and flak coming up from there, and you're distracted by that. But I think taking the forward observers from the air combat units, or pilots, and they would go up there for a spell, and then they'd come back, and someone else would go up. And I think that added a great deal to the strength.
Okay. Well, what do we...
You ready?
Yeah.
Well, you hear these stories about Patton, and he was a crusty old bastard. There's no doubt about that, because here, our air units that were supporting him across France, we had to wear the puttees and the helmets back there. And you can imagine what that did to a fighter pilot. We hated these damn guts for that. But every time Patton would capture a cache of German liquor, wine, or whatever, all of his Patton supporting units were sent their share of it. We used to say in the officers' club that there was more danger from flying champagne corks in the evening than there was from German flak in the afternoon. So whatever you think of Patton, he did give support that way. And one day he had a counterattack. German tanks were counterattacking and really messing him up. And it was a horrible day. The ceiling was about 300 feet. And he called back for support, and they sent 4 of our guys out in the P-47s with bombs. He knocked these tanks out, and by the time those guys get back to the base, they had a DSC, or Distinguished Service Cross.
Very good. Now, you said you left the ETO when?
I got I got hit on November 1 of 44. We were on a dive bombing mission, dive bombing Saarbrücken, and went down and we dropped our bombs, and it was a bad day, pretty cloudy and everything, but I got out of there and was climbing up, and damn if an 88 didn't come up, and the three shells, I could see two of them back to my right, and to the below me a little bit, but one of them got close enough that it got some stuff in the office, as we call the cockpit of those things, and knocked out all my instruments and hit me pretty badly in the right leg and left leg, and so I had no radio communication at all. They could hear me, I found out later, but I couldn't hear them, so I started back to hoping that, namely where our lines were, and I had to get down on the deck and open the cockpit because I was bleeding pretty badly and beginning to get a little woozy. So I finally saw a white helmeted MP, and I saw a Jeep going down there with two officers in it, and I buzzed them with wheels down, pulled up, put my wheels up, came down and crash landed, and I crash landed 1 mile from a frontline hospital, if you can believe it. And after that, then I spent, then they put me in a plane, sent me to England, and I stayed in the hospital there for a couple of months, and then was sent back to the States and spent a couple of months in the hospital there, and then went on down to teach combat tactics to these P-51 pilots.
Very good. Then where were you when the war ended?
At Mourmelon, France, the French equivalent of West Point.
Could you explain to us your reaction when you heard the war was over? How did it feel?
It, well, there was elation and all, but we knew the war was going to be over. We knew it could only end one way. It was just a question of time. I think it was more a matter of relief than the relief that it was over, so we could get back and get into the life. Way across Georgia, they had a prisoner of war camp there, and in it they had prisoners from the German Africa Corps, and they were cocky. You know, they'd take them out for strolls in the afternoon, real cocky guys and all this. And we used to, some of them, the lesser ones, we would use in the mess there. They would volunteer to serve in the mess and all. And we would tell these people, we said, you know, your cities are in ruins, and they just would not believe you or anything like that. Finally, when the war was over, on VE Day, and these prisoners of war were told that the war was over, Germany surrendered, they just broke down and cried. They couldn't believe it. They still believed that they were winning the war, or would win the war, because, you know, they'd only served in Africa, and they were winning at that time.
Would you believe that this was the Nazi indoctrination?
Oh yes, very much so. Very much so. Mm-hmm. These Africa Corps boys were hard-nosed cats. Very hard-nosed, especially the officers.
These were an elite
organization. Oh yes, arrogant to the nth degree. Just really arrogant. It was strange.
Two last questions, if we can. How do you believe your war experience changed your way of life, if at all?
Well, I think it matures you pretty daggone fast, much faster than you would ever mature had you not been through that. You know, when you're in there and it's kill or be killed, or you know, when your life is up in the up in the air every day, so to speak, you mature rapidly. Your thinking changes. You probably don't have time to go through that metamorphosis that each of us goes through in those early 20s, and I think that's one thing. Well, an example of that, I had no college until after the war, and I went under the GI Bill, which is the greatest thing in my life as far as I'm concerned, you know, that. Well, the vets that were in colleges there just raised the standards tremendously because, hell, we were there for one thing, and that was to learn. I felt sorry for these little freshmen coming in from the high schools at that time because they just weren't ready for that onslaught. And I think that's it, the maturity it gives you at that age, where you usually don't achieve that until later.
And, of course, what do you believe was your most lasting experience that you got from the war?
Well, lasting experience, you mean the things I remember?
Yes.
Well, I think probably the thing I remember even more than getting shot up was the time that we were down straight from this German armored column headed towards Brest out in the Brittany Peninsula, and they hit my 51. They hit one of the oil lines, and so the motor started acting up and rough and all, and I could tell I wasn't going to make it back to base, so I had to bail out. Well, that was the most frightening moment of my entire life. There it is, and the plane finally started catching on fire, and I knew I had to get out of that thing. Well, I'll tell you, when I bailed out of that and hit the ground, I didn't care whether the Germans captured me or not.
Just happy to be alive.
I think that was certainly the most frightened I ever was, because when you're hit, you don't. I don't think you're frightened. Shock, I guess, takes over, and you're really not frightened. I wasn't frightened at all. Just a feeling of, okay, I'm hit now. I've got to get out of this as best I can if I'm going to get out of it. But when you know that there's nothing wrong with you and you still have all your senses about you and you have to bail, I'll tell you, when I got back from there, it was about 2 weeks later, I stayed with the French family hid me over there. When I got back to base, the first thing I did was get some of the best booze I could and give it to that parachute rigger. Believe me. So that's probably the most memorable.
You say you were down behind enemy lines
Yeah, I
for a
was
short
down
period of
behind
time?
the enemy lines in the Brittany Peninsula there, but that was after the breakthrough at St. Lo, and I knew the Americans were coming through. So I went down and landed in this damn sort of woods there, and this farmer came out and grabbed me and said, "McCowan Allemagne." I said, "McCowan." Well, he took me into the farmhouse there and poured me a huge glass of Calvados, which I downed like water. And I don't know whether you know Calvados, but it is a very strong drink. I just downed it like water, and he hid me in there until nightfall, and then took me to this little town of Morlaix. I'd laid a finger open to get out of the plane, and took me into the house of this Dr. Daedalus, and he stitched my finger up, and I stayed in their attic, so-called, you know, the French houses that are 3 or 4 floors, and I stayed in there for, well, it was about a week and a half, until the Americans came through. And the strange thing on this I want to tell you about, the Americans came through, and the Daedalus family came out and said, "Oh, the Americans are there." So I rushed out of the house, and I no sooner got out of their house, and these French people just piled my arms with flowers and with bottles of wine. So I go down to the village square, and here in this front tank is this American major, and he says, "Well, Lieutenant, I can see who the hero of this village is." And then now, a strange thing, here I am from Uniontown, Pennsylvania, is my hometown, and going back to the Daedalus' house after this, talking with the Americans all, and some woman comes up to me in perfect English, says, "Where are you from in the States?" And I said, "Well, originally I'm from Uniontown, Pennsylvania." She said, "I'm from Pittsburgh." I couldn't believe it. Now, can you imagine, here I am out in the Brittany Peninsula in the midst of a war in 1944, just been, you know, saved, and here's a woman comes up and says, "I'm from Pittsburgh." Isn't that amazing?
That is fantastic. Listen, what I want to do is